And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Jumana Abu-Ghazaleh. Jumana is the president of Pivot for Humanity, which is an organisation founded in 2018 to professionalise the extractive, data-driven social tech industry and foster a responsible, ethical and accountable internet. So Pivot's goal is to compel an industry in crisis to adopt universal standards, norms and values that will pivot or reorient the industry towards its original mission, which is serving humanity. In 2004, Jumana founded and launched Zany, an app designed to help employers shrink virtual distance and create a thriving and emotionally engaged digital workforce. And Zany helps companies build stronger distributed teams by facilitating conversations that build interpersonal trust between remote members and lead to innovative, productive and fulfilling work. Jumana's first career was in marketing, brand strategy and communications, where she spent over 10 years developing strategies for organizations such as American Express, Yahoo, Coca-Cola, Bank of America, the Robin Hood Foundation, Ally Bank and Hilton Hotels, and she's responsible for creating Capital One's What's in Your Wallet campaign. Jumana earned her MBA from Harvard Business School and a degree in literature and philosophy from Claremont McKenna College. Welcome, Jumana, and over to you.
Cool. Really appreciate the introduction. It has been so informative, so enlightening, so enriching to listen to this dialogue and this conversation today. And I'm really, really honored to be here. As you know, Roba pointed out, I'm really not anywhere near geography, but thank you for inviting me nonetheless. Before we begin our session, I'd like to acknowledge the Munsee Lenape, the owners of the traditional owners of the land on which I stand, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. So first things first, I'm not a geographer. Actually, maps confuse me and digital maps paralyze me. They lie, they shapeshift, they play tricks on you, they move. I've walked up and down the same street too many times, over and over, up and down, because I thought the GPS was messing with me. So why am I here? Because more than ever, as we've heard before, geography is destiny. In parentheses, I thought our Australian audience might appreciate the geographic determinism here. But yes, geography is destiny, and command of geography is power. And with power comes responsibility. To Jeremy Pitt's point in the opening, what we're talking about today is sort of a modern colonialism. So I'm here to talk about the tremendous power geographers have and to ask you to not shy away from the responsibility that comes with it. I'm the founder, as Roba mentioned, of an organization, Pivot for Humanity, devoted to professionalizing the tech sector. And while I initially prepared for this talk by doing a lot of research on GIS and academic geography as a whole, the more research I did, the more I realized that what I'm grappling with in my work is intimately related to the various issues that came up in today's session. A metaphor that's been making the rounds for years now with regards to big data is that data is the new oil, a hidden treasure, insanely valuable, endlessly productive. You have to mine for it, to excavate it. But oil isn't valuable just because it's oil. It's not like diamonds. It's valuable because of what it allows us to do. It's the same with data. We've heard today about the environment and the environment, about surveillance, surveillance, dataveillance, and uberveillance. And why does it all matter? Because all too often what we're actually talking about is the reduction of rich, vibrant, diverse, deep peoples and places and the non-human world into usable raw material, into data for the powerful, to do what they want with, infer from what they desire, and shape as they please. So what became very clear to me as I prepared for this talk is if data is the new oil, then geography is most definitely its refinery. Why? Because GIS is what turns that crude data into policy, into policing, into bank loan practices like redlining, into housing, into environmental priorities, into vaccination rollouts, into winners and losers, into unwitting victims and culprits, into terrorists and freedom fighters. And just like that, GIS can be used to weaponize data. Who gets recognized? Who doesn't? Google, or the GIS experts at contracts might not wish to be an arbiter of this kind of question, but they will be treated as an arbiter and authority on these kinds of questions in popular discourse, whether they choose to or not. So if data is the most valuable commodity in the world, then the people who refine it, GIS practitioners, play a crucial part in determining how and when it's used. And this is a real problem because not everyone's going to be a Rebecca Jones. Rebecca Jones is the recipient of a 2014 AAG Affinity Award for superb academic research in paleo-environmental change. She's also the most prominent whistleblower geographer in the United States. The Jones case is somewhat controversial, and still being fought in the US court system. But here's what we do know. Jones was a GIS manager for the Florida Department of Health, where she was tasked with creating the Florida Department of Health COVID-19 dashboard. On May 18th, 2020, Jones was fired from that position for what she claims was refusing to fudge COVID-19 case data in order to make reopening the state more politically palatable. Later that year, Florida State Police raided her home and seized her personal electronics for reasons Jones claims were retaliatory. Now, others might have avoided trouble from that point forward. Instead, Jones created an alternate national COVID-19 case dashboard, the COVID Monitor, one fact that is fact-checked and cited as an authoritative resource by both the New York Times and Vox.com. She, like MG Michael, evidently, can't not do what she's doing. Jones should have been able to say no and protect her job, because it was part of her job to say no, to do no harm, which in this case means to accurately reflect the state of the disease so people are informed and able to make better decisions. How many people are out there who saw something and said nothing? Who decided it wasn't worth risking their employment in the midst of a pandemic, particularly in the United States, where losing a job can quite literally mean losing your health insurance and your home? For how many was it easier to just ignore the code of ethics they ostensibly signed upon membership, particularly when it has no consequences? A well-intentioned code practitioners are asked to familiarize themselves with puts too much pressure on the practitioner without setting them up for success or protecting them in any way. Did they read it carefully? Do they know how to apply it? Is it part of a shared understanding? Or is it something they're supposed to figure out all alone? Too often, practitioners are on their own to sink or swim. They can be martyrs or they can play along. Those are the choices offered by guidelines without training and enforcement. Encouragement, but no net to catch you. The code of ethics should guide behavior, absolutely, but it should also be a tool that practitioners can use to defend themselves. And the only way that happens is that if there is adequate training and real consequences. GIS practitioners are very often asked to make difficult decisions, to make choices, to meet demands. Who's looking out for them? Who's on their side? Their bosses? Usually not. This is something that tech workers in Silicon Valley have grappled with quite a bit recently. In the time since Joan was fired, we've seen whistleblowers fired at Google, Amazon, and Facebook. We're going to see Silicon Valley and GIS workers face pressures to act unethically for much the same motivations and pressures, from COVID-19 and vaccine data, to accurately measuring and conveying climate change, to drawing congressional districts, to telling the truth about election results. So what do we do about a status quo that is going to increasingly call on geographers to be whistleblowers? In my view, the number one priority has to be to prepare and protect the practitioners, the geographers. Geoethics statements are a start, and I think of them as signaling intent, but we all know what they say about the road to hell. We need more than intent. We need institutions that see themselves as the protectors of those codes and norms and of the people entrusted to live by them. We need the AAG to give geographers a reason to care as professionals, not just as individuals with integrity about ethics. If we feel that ethics matter, we need to know what role we want them to play in the life of geographers. As it currently stands, ethics instruction plays at best a minor role in GIS certification. To quote University College of London Associate Professor of Archaeology, Mark Al-Tawil, GIS certification certifications have incorporated ethics. However, often this is a simple signature that promises to abide by ethical guidelines rather than any formal education on the use of GIS within ethical limits. So let me ask you, when you agree to a website's terms and conditions, and Christine Paraxlis mentioned this earlier, do you know them all? Absorb them? Fully understand what you've supposedly agreed to, what you're responsible for? I'm going to hazard a guess. No, you don't. They're they're TLDR, as they say on the internet, too long didn't read, right? But we click agree anyway, because it's the only thing left standing between us and our goal. In a 2018 study to get an empirical idea of how far consumers could be conned into going, the authors created a fake social networking site called NameDrop and wrote up a terms and conditions service agreement for users to agree to before signing up. In the agreement, they included the disclosure that users give up their firstborn child as payment and that anything users shared would be passed along to the NSA. A whopping 98% of participants agreed. So the question is, do GIS practitioners know what they're agreeing to when they've agreed to a code of ethics? This is ultimately, in my view, a question of relative location. What's where? Where should ethics live in relation to the practice of GIS? In curricula, in training, in practice, vested in an organization or body of stakeholder organizations? Why is it there? We need to consider its proximity to the task at hand. How close is it to the field? A reference point, a precedent we point to every so often, or is it integrated into how the work is done? And why care? How distant are the consequences? Geographers are people who have to make choices. They have bosses with opinions, they have careers, they have ambitions. How does breaking a code of ethics affect them? And if all the incentives are perverse, are there any positive incentives we can enforce? To put it directly, if we know geographers will increasingly be called upon to either be whistleblowers or enablers, then we have to ask, how far are practitioners located from any real understanding of ethics and any real consequence for making the wrong call? And what is the AAG's role in facilitating that? If we want ethics to matter, really matter, then we have to make space for it, commit the resources, and take the time to place ethics near the center instead of the periphery, in the muck, in the middle, at the heart, and suffused through practice. Because GIS is too important, too valuable, too powerful a discipline to go unchecked. Oh, pardon me. As GIS ethicist and Professor Georgiadou's paper outlined in 2008, no other value has been as pervasive in GIS science as efficiency. But efficiency is not a value neutral technical term. It is a contestable political claim. Everybody supports the abstract idea of efficiency, but to apply the concept to concrete policy choices requires making assumptions about who and what counts as important. And there are no correct answers to these questions outside the political process. In my own lived experience as a Palestinian living in the United States, I'm all too aware of how the seemingly antiseptic questions of lines changing on a map are directly tied to questions of power and priority. The same could be said for many regions of the world where land is contested. And it's not just maps. GIS is vital to how the modern world works. I know I'm not the only one who got chills listening to Christine Paraxlis talking about the confluence of the valences and the Internet of Things and People. Who lives where? What are their kids doing? When? Who's watching? Why? Who profits from this? At what cost and to whom? Who gets to decide what information should be used and for what purpose? GIS is not a value-neutral technical field, and a focus on ethical training and preparation needs to be a priority, an urgent priority. Ultimately, this is about values and skills. Do our institutions have room to quantify and certify both? And do we value ethics enough to make GIS a practitioner's duty to care? To make it a professional requirement instead of just a personal decision? If so, then it's imperative to shift the practitioner's relationship with ethics from nice to haves to cannot, must not, will not do without, from something to sign to something they're regularly reminded of, something they learn and internalize, something they're equipped and prepared to apply because it is a part of their job and not just an individual personal preference. Enabling such a shift requires considering a long-term goal of licensure for ethical training and practice. It's not clear to me just now that the AAG has the resources to provide licensure, but perhaps it can strengthen the ethical component of its certification and take steps towards the ideal of licensure. To that end, it would be wonderful to see a focus on ethical training and preparedness in the next iteration of the AAG's long-range plan, because it would mean the AAG cares not just about ethics in principle, but about the readiness of its members to live up to them. Geography is a field of immense public import with consequences for virtually every aspect of our lives. AAG members always knew that, but between COVID-19, battling electoral maps, climate change, and the ubiquitous GIS technology that end users see all the time, now we non-geographers know it too. And those of us outside the field with less power will be looking to institutions like the AAG, hoping you can guide your members to make some tough calls in this crazy, crazy world, confident that membership in the AAG means practitioners, for their own security, I love that term, are prepared, expected, and empowered to practice ethical GIS in a world that increasingly puts them under pressure, on the spot, and in the crosshairs. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jumana. What a brilliant, brilliant talk. There are some comments that I think are directed to you, Jumana, and in general about ethics. I'm in agreement, Roger Clark. I think, does anyone want to unmute or ask any specific questions? Please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I've got a specific question, and it's related, I guess, to the practitioner's dilemma that Jumana just touched on and explored in her discussion piece there. And it's I guess looking at like investigative journalists in over the past 20, 30 years and longer, this concept of the whistleblower, and over the past 2 or 3 years, we've seen more practitioners that are investigating everything from algorithmic bias to deception patterns used in shopping carts, actually being targeted or disempowered and fired. How do we nurture the practitioners moving forward so that they do feel that they can speak out? Because speaking out has consequences. And I think increasingly so when the power is disproportionately put in the hands of big tech and government.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I absolutely agree. The challenge, I believe, is that there are only consequences really on one side. And so part of my work and the idea of professionalization is to embed ethics so that it is part and parcel of the job, so that you're not actually doing your job and could lose your license if you're not practicing ethical, taking, an ethical approach to your work, and giving that in effect. And right now when we say weaponize, it's usually negative, but weaponizing that, allowing the practitioners to weaponize that so they can say, no, I'm not going to lose my license because you're telling me to lie. I'm not going to do this because I took an oath not to. And so putting some power in the hand of the practitioner to push back on the endless demands of more, better, faster, cheaper, don't worry about the rules, being able to say, I have a body or an institution that to which I am committed, of which I'm a member, that holds these things to be sacred, important, and material. And I am committed to live that way is an important part of the process. So the idea of professionalization is, a codification of norms. So it's not the end all and be all, but it's right now in the tech space, as you know, there aren't any. The North Star that technology has is more, bigger, faster, cheaper. And with, public interest is nowhere on the map, no pun intended. But once once you make it part of somebody's job to consider the ethics and the ethical decisions, and as Jeremy Pitt said really early on in the talk, to ask yourself and ask people around you really difficult questions, to make that part of your job, and to contemplate, to think about thinking and the things that you're doing rather than just innovating for innovating's sake, I think is a massive step in the right direction, because it puts power, some sense of power and some sense of integrity, I mean bodily, mental integrity, into each individual doing their job.
Thank you, Jumana. Matt, would you like to respond to that? I saw you unmute.
Just, I guess briefly, I don't want to hog the floor there. Jumana, thanks for that. Now, I think what Mark had referenced in the chat, professional societies, and I guess the follow-up question this might spur further discussion is, like, does the professional society protect me as a practitioner, my life, my livelihood, if I speak truth to power and call out objectively, what is, legal is one thing, but ethical is another, a large organization that I work for? And how does it do that?
I mean, I think it depends on the association, but I think ultimately it comes down to this. I talk about licensure and licensing of morality or moral ethical behavior, and not just a skill set. So if a body is focused on licensing or certifying a certain skill set, and ethics is an afterthought, we cannot expect the society to give any meaningful guidance to an ethical framework. But this takes time, right? So in the medical profession, for example, or in engineering proper, where the consequences are massive and potentially dire, there are norms that are codified. And what that allows you to do is, even on a one-to-one basis, if you are members in the same association, to point each other out and say, we took an oath to not do this. You can actually look at somebody in the eye and say, you're breaking the code that we took together when we got our license. There is no such accountability, no such responsibility on the individual level, let alone, so there's not even a community of practice that helps define what's right or what's wrong. And until an association decides that ethics is something, along with skills, along with coding languages, along with other technical skills, is something that needs to be taught and trained and revisited every once in a while. So as an association, one of the duties could be to make sure that every once in a while, just like a lawyer, every few years has to take an ethics training course and make sure that they're still on top of it. How do we keep ethics front and center? How do we keep it near the heart? If, engineers, there are many different versions of the provenance of the ring, but ultimately they wear a ring on their drawing hand so that it's constantly in touch with the paper as a reminder of what they're doing and how important it is, and the commitment that they made to the profession. And again, this isn't foolproof, but a set of norms around which a community can rally and feel protected by its own membership, I think is hugely important.
Thank you, Jumana, and thank you, Matt. I think there are so many points there that we can spend days talking on, particularly the integration of ethics and all of these excellent points that you mentioned, Jumana, into STEM and other curricula. I think that's crucial. Before I close this webinar, I'd really like to call on Professor Marcus Wiggin to share some insights, particularly given his work in a number of different disciplines, from GIS to IT, right through to ethics. I'd really like to hear from Marcus, and I know many here would too. The floor is yours, Marcus. Thank you.
There are a couple of things to point out, and from the area you're now working in, Jumana, the process of registration state by state, which is a huge, beautiful barrier against services from Australia, although that's been partly overcome. That is actually one of the weapons that are used to reinforce the ethics behaviors. As I said, I've got an ethics master's from a quite recent period, and have applied it in order to help shift the perspective of the Professional Ethics Committee of the Australian Computer Society from protection of the organisation, which is the classic way of doing 15 points, which you have to subscribe to actually being in a position of an active mode. I got it as far as I reasonably could and walked away so it wouldn't be identified with me, and it has indeed continued slowly. That is the process needed in the geographers. I was a geographer over 10 years as a senior fellow at Monash in human geography with a special interest in GIS. In fact, I taught GIS and transport applications in the early 90s at Sydney University. So none of this is stranger to me. The key problem there was the pricing issue of geospatial data, which had a huge premium. And the ethical frameworks surrounding that were quite fascinating. We are running into a situation where more and more areas of professional activity are being forced into considering what the roles and behaviors should be for individuals within organizations. And organizations are being caught up when they don't comply with social license. And the word ethics is used in a rather throwaway way, but on the other hand, it catches up. Organizations now speak of social license with some nervousness, correctly. Social license is essentially behaving in an ethical manner that's accepted by the community as ethical and reasonable. So I think we need to have several different types of language when we're discussing this to get progress. One is social license to operate. How do you get it? What do you do when somebody moves outside that space? Now, when you say that, any manager immediately starts jumping. We have to reframe these discussions so that they're understandable from different discipline standpoints. I've run through more disciplines than I can remember, and the common factor in each of them is they don't know much about the others. So the lessons don't get learned. They don't get transferred. Every university screams about transdisciplinarity. You offer them a transdiscipline person and they sprint the other way at the speed of light. I can assure you of that from personal experience in at least 4 universities, including Melbourne, where they have I think it's a deputy vice chancellor responsible for transdisciplinarity. After his talk, I went up to him and said, Andrew, I have done every single thing you describe in this university. When are you calling on me? Of course, it didn't happen. So no, I'm serious. This is actually a genuine exchange, which I'm prepared to put on record in a situation like this. It's quite appalling. So how do we get people to understand what ethics actually means? A lot of people in academic areas haven't really run into management issues. They have, of course, become heads of departments, as I did, and discovered the hard way that the staff expect you to look after them and the admin expect you to push it down onto them. Very interesting position, hardly an ethical one, but certainly not one that's disclosed to anybody who gets into that position. However, universities are not tremendously ethical environments. In fact, I would strongly recommend that you didn't consider them as ethical environments and you'll survive better. What environments are ethical? That's the real question underpinning the whole thing. So if we're starting to get people responding to the fact that values are not being recognized in the community and individual disciplines are coming up to the target, that's the issue that we've been addressing from 6 or 7 different angles.
Just one, thank you for that. One way I'd answer your question is I don't think corporations or organizations or associations can be or should be seen as ethical. I think individuals are the ones who are ethical or not, but I think that means they have to be prepared to be, they have to know, they have to have the tool set and to understand what that means in their field, in whatever they're doing, what questions to ask. And I think that's where the challenge is how do you prepare practitioners, geographers, GIS practitioners, to not just practice their skill, but to practice it ethically without making ethics part of their training. When you make it an add-on, it's something that is the responsibility of an organization versus a duty of an individual. And I think that's the biggest thing we're seeing. These people are leaving because they, as individuals, decided that they have ethics, not because an institution, gave them a mark that said they were ethical. Ethics lives in the individual. And one of the things that we need to do is to be able to protect people who try to be ethical. And that, I think, the protective part, the training and the training and preparation and the protection is what I believe is the role of so training in curricula or in universities and certification, and then the protection in the associations.
I spent 17 years teaching engineers and many other disciplines who wanted to come how to deal with professionalism in transport, which is a hugely multidisciplinary domain. And it was the first time the engineering department has ever allowed people from every other discipline to come. And what I was explaining was what is perceived as professional from each of the different roles, from political right the way through the beginning, how information traveled through, what was persistent, what were the frameworks, what were the arguments that were used, and why they were used. Unless there is a little bit more serious attention to education instead of training, which is what I did, we will continue to have this problem. And there is no university, there is no place I know on the planet who will actually pick this up and deal with it, because it goes through every one of the little areas, the bit of territories that everybody has and they hang on to under competition. So it's a very fragile point. But education is to lead people to understand. We don't do that very much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think your comment, I'm taking it as a more general one, and I'd hope that you'd consider that one as a contribution.
Absolutely. I mean, I think education is vital. I think that it's not well, that's what I mean when I talk about putting it at the heart, at the center, to learn it the way, to make it part of lived experience, and to learn it and understand it and explore it in the and give it the respect that we do other fields or topics or skills that get more attention. So I'm actually in agreement. I hope I didn't misdirect.
Well, I'm sure that everybody hears everything from a different perspective, so I'm certain you didn't.
Thank you, Jumana. Thank you also, Marcus and Matt, for your comments.